So we're still waiting on a couple more people to join us from the board. We'll get started in just a minute. Brenda should be joining us any moment.
Thanks, Melody.
Mhm. And there she is.
Okay, looking at the screen, looks like we're all on. Jeff, you got all your crew on? Everybody's on that should be? Tracy,
Yes,
I
sir.
understand you're traveling?
Yes, I mean, I'm in the car. I'm just sitting in a car, but I can put that background on. But I just didn't know if you wanted me to have it on.
No, it's okay. Whatever works for you.
Okay.
All right, so at this point, we're going to call this work session to order, so we can just jump right in. Jeff, going to go to you immediately.
First, can we take the roll call?
You still want to do a roll call on me, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Just make sure everyone's present. So I'm going to go ahead and do the roll call. Please indicate if you're present. Mayor Ronald Pappas,
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Brenda McMillan,
Present.
Commissioner Jason Hall,
Present.
Commissioner Ann Simpson,
Present.
Commissioner Pedro Moray,
Present.
Commissioner Tracy Westlake.
Present.
All right, everyone's present.
Makes a long list now, doesn't it? All right, very good, Jeff. Court is yours.
All right, thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, everybody. On a very nasty, rainy day, appreciate everybody taking up their afternoon for our, I believe this is our 5th LDC review session, and a couple of quick housekeeping things before we dive back in. So we have 2 more sessions scheduled now on the 5th. For that afternoon, and as well as the late afternoon on the 12th as a work session running up to our regular board meeting. So hopefully after today, we'll be able to get through the rest of the content on those 2 days. Then the idea will be at our retreat to be able to tie it all back together, where we will review all of the things that have been discussed, the revisions that we've made. For instance, a couple of the zoning district adjustments and things based on board comments, and then other places in the code from comments, and then of course be able to show the updated formatting. everything together, hopefully to tie it in a bow or to continue to talk about it as we need to. And then after that, we'll see where we are. So that is the plan. Hopeful to still have an adoption date sometime in the mid to late winter. So with saying that, we will pick up where we left off at our last review, and that is chapter 12. We'll start back up with a certificate of appropriateness. And then after we finish these last few pages of this chapter, then we'll go into chapter 6, which is all of the design standards. So Madison will be leading us through the last few pages of the historic preservation chapter, and then Blair will be leading you through the design standards chapter. So I will turn the floor over to Madison.
Thank you, Jeff. Can everyone see my screen where we left off for section 12.4? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. So diving back in and then kind of starting off. So once again, certificate of appropriateness, kind of like what's going to be coming up after this, as far as demolition by neglect, are all things specific to landmarks. So these are specific to our 4 landmarks we have downtown. So certificate of appropriateness is pretty much an approval to modify a landmark. So as far as something that's more major, the Historic Preservation Commission will review a certificate of appropriateness application to ensure that it's maintaining and preserving the landmark as it is. So we start off with 12.4.A. This is directly from 160D-947. It talks about activities requiring a certificate of appropriateness. So after the designation of a landmark or a historic district, no exterior portion of a building or other structure shall be altered, moved, demolished, and any sort of extreme modification. So this kind of outlines where the town shall require a certificate to be issued by our Historic Preservation Commission. And so this guideline or guides this as well. Like I said, this is word for word from 160D. Hey, Ann.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I am. So I have a question because under paragraph A, it says after the application for a certificate of appropriateness, it says it will be submitted and approved by the commission, which I think you might have changed to
You already did.
the Historic Preservation Commission. Should the Board of Commissioners be part of that process?
So this is typically, as far as I know, with the town and then kind of what generally is done, I guess throughout the state, is this is something that strictly lies within our Historic Preservation Commission. So they're the ones who kind of review it because they're typically the subject knowledge experts, and so they just kind of like with our facade improvement program, they're pretty strict with what can be and cannot be done. So this has kind of been left with them.
I guess for consistency, like we have in other parts, like they would do the investigation, make the recommendation, and then it usually gets for the board to make the final ultimate decision. Would we not follow that process like we have in the other parts of the chapters?
No, I don't know. As far as this, I don't know if the state, I mean, it specifically has this underneath historic preservation. So as far as the Board of Commissioners having the final say, I'm not too sure. I'd have to read specifically more in depth into the general statute.
And I'll take a look at that. I'll as Madison goes on here, I've got the statute pulled up. I'll take a look and see if that's an option.
And as a follow-up to that, and perhaps I'll ask the question maybe in a different way. Following this process, would it be possible for a certificate of appropriateness to be filed with the HPC, to demolish a landmark the HPC approves it, and then the landmark is demolished without the board who represents the town to have a say in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. As Ann mentioned, I mean, you guys are the ones who have the final say of landmarks. And so I think one of the biggest reasons, other than us having landmarks, why the HPC was established by the state is specific to certificate of appropriateness. Like I said, that's been the history as far as I've known. I will state that I think in the last several years, there's only been one certificate of appropriateness application filed. And so that was for, I guess, over on the Dream Chaser side of the pedestrian bridge, they had to remove or modify one or two steps. And so as a part of that, they did a certificate of appropriateness. And that was back when our previous senior planner, Max Oliver, was here. And that was probably at least 4 or 5 years ago. And that's the only one that I've even known of. So this is usually not something that's as common. Now, if we had a local historic district, as it mentions in section A, this would probably be significantly more common.
See if Brenda had a question.
Brenda, you had a question?
My questions was similar to Commissioner Simpson and also Commissioner Hall, and also in requesting that you do check the statutes to find out that if in fact the language that you were using is statutory, and if it is not, that to concur with them that the Board of Commissioners be included in the say as to not leaving it to the Historic Preservation Commission, especially if in fact, you know, there was a statute that is going to be taken, landmark that's going to be taken down or something. And if it is in the town, that we should actually be informed and be able to have a final word in that.
So I'm looking at the statute now under powers of the Historic Preservation Commission. And it does not look like that, at least at first look over, but I'll look over it again. It does not look like that they have to be the final authority there. So if we make the assumption that is the case, then we're happy to make that adjustment. But I'll keep reading here to make sure.
So I pulled up the powers of the Historic Preservation Commission. And so one of their powers is to review and act upon proposals for alterations, demolitions, or new construction within historic districts, or for the alteration or demolition of designated landmarks pursuant to this part. So it gives them the authority to review and act upon alterations and demolitions to landmarks, which would be a certificate of appropriateness.
Oh, yep, there it is. Paragraph or sentence 10.
And yep.
I mean, are we required to have them act, or can we go through and really define what act means? Because I think going back to Mayor Pro Tem McMillan, I would like to see the Board of Commissioners involved in some of that process or decision making, as opposed to leaving it just solely on a volunteer board.
We'll make it a Charlie question. Guess we'll need to have Charlie be pulled in on that one. What it says.
I guess my concern too is, I mean, we have a lot of volunteers, but where this is a very specific knowledge area, the historic preservation, I mean, you'd want to make sure that we have, you know, the right skill set. And I know in the past it's been difficult to go out and recruit people for our different boards and commissions. And so, you know, I'd want to make sure that we could vet that decision-making through either through us or even through something through the state to really ensure that, you know, it's being made appropriately.
Yep. And I will say now that our now HBC chair, Terry Settle, and then our new vice chair, Chris Moorfield, are very knowledgeable. I've never met anybody more than Chris, but maybe her mom. that is more knowledgeable of the history of Waxhaw. And Terry Settle, the chair, is very adamant about historic preservation. So I think as it sits right now, it's very good, in very good hands. But as for future, if they step off, I don't know about that.
We'll see what Charlie thinks. So the statute reference is 160D-942, Powers of Historic Preservation Commission, and it's down on paragraph 10. It says review and act upon proposals for alterations, demolitions, or new construction within historic districts or for the alteration or demolition of designated landmarks pursuant to this part. So we'll check that. We'll see what Charlie thinks.
Yeah, I guess my question would be is how do we define act? I mean, as manager, you're able to act on our behalf and sign contracts. Is that the type of powers that they're going to be granted in this type of role?
That's what I would interpret it to be, but I'm not the attorney either, so it's probably best to let him give us a little direction on that one.
Or can we also define what we would want in terms of that language? Our expectation of what action would be?
And I certainly think you could put something in the code with expectation wise that builds up and above. You can certainly go up and above what the statutory language is for something like that, I think.
Any further questions?
We'll rely on the follow-up with your team, Jeff, to figure that out and get back to us.
Okay. So talk about section A. Section B is directly from our general statute as well. It mentions HBC shall have no jurisdiction over interior arrangement and shall take no action to pretty much prevent the restoration of an indoor of the interior and specifically to the exterior. And so in section C, it pretty much says that by consent, the HBC may have authority over the interior features. And so this is also from the general statute. So such written consent of owner for interior review shall bind future owners to consent as far as having the interior features reviewed and by the HBC. And so section D, relocation, demolition, or destruction, an application for a certificate of appropriateness or a COA authorizing the relocation or destruction of a landmark may not be denied except as provided in subsection 12.4 .d.a of this section. And so this references this, so we probably need to update that little insert about the section. But HBC may negotiate with the owner and with any other parties in an effort of means of preserving the building or site. If the HBC finds that the building or site within the district is of no special significance, it shall waive all or parts of such period and authorize earlier demolition or removal. And then section E, denial of certificate. This just talks about may be denied except where the HBC finds the owner would suffer extreme hardship or be permanently deprived of all beneficial use or returned by virtue of the denial. That's pretty much saying a certificate may be denied except where the owners may suffer extreme hardship. And then subsection F just talks about ordinary maintenance or repair. So it's saying that there's nothing should be done to prevent the ordinary maintenance or repair of an exterior architectural feature. And so that's pretty much the summation of that section. Yes, Anne.
So here's a question that I have, because it says exterior architecture feature in a historic district or of a landmark. Are we talking both here?
Yeah, so I think when it's talking about architectural feature in a historic landmark or in a historic district, so that kind of goes back to if we have a local historic district and there's going to be, you know, it's talking about ordinary maintenance of, you know, if we have a historic house within a local district, it's talking about that specifically. But I think you're right, because this section is just specifically about certificate of appropriateness.
So if you had a historic house that's in a historic district but is not a landmark, would this apply?
So with it's now with our national historic district, no. But if we have a local historic district, where it encompasses historic homes or historic commercial buildings, then this would apply.
And then my other
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And then my other question is that, let's say there is a historic building or landmark and it's in disrepair and the owner doesn't have the funds to fix it, right? And I know we get down into a section here about financial hardship.
Yeah.
But my question here is, who would pay for that? And if it's the town's responsibility because now they're part of this district, or it's a historic landmark, what's the liability to the town on that?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the liability on the town. I know it's, you know, it gives for demolition by neglect, it gives like a year-long period to try to find, like HBC would try to find a new owner, or HBC would come up with the money to purchase the property and maintain it. I'm not too sure how often that actually happens, not just within Waxhaw, but outside in other jurisdictions. So I don't know if anything as far as liability would fall into the town unless we purchase it and then never renovate or repair. Like I said, I haven't seen anything like this thus far. Like I said, because we only have 4 landmarks and we don't have a local historic district.
But the way this language is written, if there was a local historic district and there was a house that was a historic house, I mean, this whole section would apply.
Yes, that's correct.
So then I
And-
guess the question is, what would happen in the event that it did apply?
Yeah, so I guess what would happen, let's say you own a house in this local historic district. You want to do something that is considered a major alteration. You would have to go through the approval process with the Historic Preservation Commission. Now, I think for ordinary maintenance or repair, you know, let's say you're repairing a wood frame window because your son threw a baseball and shattered the glass. I don't think something like that, as far as repair or maintenance, would not be something that would require approval, but anything that's more major would, or any large alteration.
So in the event that the homeowner does not or is not around or available to take care of this and it falls onto the town, then in that event, what would happen?
I think that's when the town or the zoning administrator would notice the property. They would notice that it's in lack of repair. They would issue a citation or something stating, hey, this house is in disrepair. It needs to be brought back up to standards. And at that point, if they no longer live there or they don't have the financial security to do so, I think that's when the demolition by neglect kind of may or may not kick in, as far as trying to find someone to either help pay for or find new owner, or you know, or other a means of preserving the property.
Yeah, in any other process, it would be a minimum housing type issue. But when it would be in regards to an area that it was either an historic landmark or a historic district, that's when you have that additional layer that's within this chapter, where you want to try to do what you can to try to save that through whatever means that you have necessary. Now, you know, the reality of it is, just like with any other issue, is you're going to give the owner every opportunity possible to mitigate it time and time again before the town stepped in and tried to do anything, and would probably be, I would say, very, very generous as far as timing would be concerned to try to get something to act, especially if it wound up being that we had to be involved in some way, shape, or form. And it just gives us a way to be able to try to initiate a property like this to be repaired, and gives us an avenue to do that otherwise you'd really be into a minimum housing type situation where you'd have to go through that process and then condemn it. And then ultimately it would be up to the town to tear that down if the owner is absent, and then of course put a lien on the property or something like that to incur that cost at some time down the road. That's what normally would happen in a case that wouldn't involve something that's in a historic district or a historic landmark.
Jeff, do we have a process that we follow, at least in the beginning? Ultimately, I mean, it would obviously be up to us to make the final judgment, but in the beginning, when such a process starts, do we have set times and dates and allowances that bring us to a point where we have to act on it?
I think we would follow similar to what we would have in our administrative section, where we're dealing with code violations, things of that such, where we give people the certain amount of time to address the issue. And then of course, if they approach us and have some type of schedule or some type of means to be able to address those situations, then we work with them. A lot of times if we don't hear back from them, or they're belligerent for some reason, then that usually puts the clock at a more normal time process, but that's rarely the case. I mean, most people that run into these issues, it's for a reason. They may not have the means to work on it and be able to fix it all at once. For instance, where as long as they have a plan to fix something, you work with them to try to get it back up to where it was. I mean, that's the type of process that we typically do with code enforcement for buildings. So it's a lot different with other type code enforcement issues, but when you're dealing with buildings, that's the typical process.
Right. No, I understand that, but shouldn't that maybe be echoed, or that sort of language should be included? That way we have a reference point, and again, looking forward, we understand that's how it goes maybe today or how it's done in the past, but maybe going forward, something written there to guide folks into what needs to happen for whatever purpose, whether you're working with the homeowner or the property owner and such. And that way people understand that these are the principles that we're kind of going off of. That way they don't just read this chapter and really not know what to go by. For example, what you're going to do as far as referencing the building codes and those statutes, but someone else might not.
It's a good suggestion. We can add the language in there. We'll do that.
But what also happens in the event that you cannot get the homeowner to be accountable, or the homeowner is not available, and then it may in fact be a home that is a landmark and historic in site, and they want to have it demolished? I mean, is that something that would then fall to the town, or would the town take ownership and say, hey, we want to keep this or leave this building here? Or is that something also that is possible in this situation?
I don't think the town can take ownership of it, but I mean, the town could take initiative with it, I guess, for a way to describe it, as is talked about in the code, being able to find the financial means to be able to get whatever the structure is.
So financially, then that burden could ultimately fall to the town?
Like with any other case, yeah, ultimately it's possible. Just like with any case when you're dealing with a building like that. It doesn't happen very often though. and probably wouldn't in a case like this either, I wouldn't think, though, you obviously can't guarantee that, but yeah, it is possible that ultimately, in order to save a building or some part of a building, it could.
Okay, let's use an example. This is not, I don't know if it's a landmark or it's not designated as a historic building or home currently, but if you have the Rodman House that is right there across from Dream Chasers, and in fact, that is described as a historic landmark, historic home, and that building now is in disrepair, but the owners are either unavailable or cannot take care of that property, then with that financial building, since it may in fact, or people may want to keep it, that burden then falls to the town.
It possibly could, yes.
It's a Charlie question. We should probably have language to that effect also.
And I guess I understand in the section where if something's designated a landmark, I think where it gets a little sticky is a historic district, and well, right now we don't have one, but if we were to adopt a local historic district and something was deemed a historic home or property, like Mayor Pro Tem McMillan said, the Rodman House, that's pretty significant to the town's history. It's like, I mean, it really goes back to the liability. I mean, if it can't be repaired or it's in disrepair, and then as a town, are we going to be responsible for maintaining that or taking that over?
Well, there's no question that if you went to a district and had, who knows how many properties within that district, then yeah, theoretically, that could certainly increase your liability. There's no question about it. But that'll be another Charlie question.
So do we have a process to designate something a historic home in this? I mean, I know we're talking about something different, but if we go back to the historic district and we can say like the Rodman House is so significant to our history and we want to designate that a historic home, does that have to go through the national process? Do we have our own process? And how would that be identified through a historic district? Because I think that's where the concern is.
Yeah, so for a landmark, we have the procedure for that. Well, let's say, because you'd mentioned the hotel beside the Niven Price building. So it's on the National Registry because they did a survey when they did the National Historic District boundary. So you could do something with the State Historic Preservation Office where they come out, they survey the house. They usually check to see if there's been any facade alterations, kind of the upkeep of the property, and they note its significance as either it being contributing or non-contributing. And so you could get it on the registry that way. And so that's why you see a lot of properties downtown or within our National Historic District that have those plaques, because when they did the survey and how they kind of shaped the district, they based it on the number of contributing structures and kind of where those sat in the downtown area. So that's always an option that you could do as far as getting on the National Registry. I know you have like tax credits and stuff too as well.
I guess I understand the national process, but I guess, when we're talking about if we did a local historic district, what would predicate home being on there as a historic home to Waxhaw? I mean, does it have to go through that process, or can, everyone in town say, the Rodman House was so important to the town, we want it as a historic home? And it would fall under these guidelines.
And my understanding that is if you had, so you've got the 4 landmarks now, if you created a district, say you created one block, just for a simple example of a district, anything that falls within that block would be subject to.
Just correct. Yeah.
So essentially that would be designating that block as a landmark for simplicity.
In a sense, it'd be required to follow the same requirements if it was a landmark without actually calling it a landmark, in a sense. Yeah.
So just to be clear, if we adopted a local historic district, everything within that district would basically have to follow the rules and process and procedures as a landmark.
Yeah, so they would, so we have, our Waxhaw Historic District, or Historic Landmark Guidelines. And so this is what we use for our facade improvement program, but they would be required to follow the design standards in this as far as, what is ordinary maintenance, what is minor work, what is a major work. So this would apply to everything within the district.
Can I ask you, how did that document become to being?
I would say probably with the establishment of the landmarks, we had to have some kind of guiding document as far as if there were any modifications. And I think whenever the facade improvement program was adopted in 2013, they kind of tagged it on with this too as a way to kind of make sure if someone's updating the facade of their commercial building or their residential home at one point, they were actually doing it in a manner that's historically accurate, rather than replacing your wood frame windows, putting in vinyl windows, and then the town paying 50% of that cost when it's not really historic to the property.
And that two questions. So the landmark design and guideline standards, who authored that? I mean, was that from the town? Is that taken from the national historic type thing? Or, I mean.
Yep. So they were drafted by, looks like Hill Studio and then Benchmark Planning. So it looks like they were done alongside a consultant. And they were likely done with the current Historic Preservation Commission members, is what I would imagine. I don't know if the Board of Commissioners at the time had some kind of say. I'd imagine they would, especially with the drafting of a document like this. But that far exceeds any of our timeline with the town, because it looks like adopted February 10th, 2011. So they're, yeah, more than 9 years.
Melody, is there a way that you can have that sent out to all of us, that document?
Certainly.
Yeah, I can get that document to you, Melody, and then you can send it out.
And then one last question, and then I'll let Commissioner McMillan speak, is if we go through this process and we had a local historic district, would it fall under the same guidelines that the owner would have to approve if they wanted their house as a historic home?
No, not in the district.
So if we adopted a local historic district, any homeowner would not have to consent for their home to be added into that district or to these rules and regulations, correct?
It's different. I mean, it's a whole area versus one specific location.
Yeah, so that's why this, back in the day, I think it was a difficult topic. But from what I've gathered at our National Historic District, a local historic district would not have to follow the specific area of the National Historic District. So the town could designate, kind of how Jeff said it as an example, as a block, or 2 blocks, or however big. So that's just something I just wanted to put out there as well, so it wouldn't have to match the boundaries of our National Historic District.
Yeah, so Madison, I've got a couple things to follow up on.
Okay.
Actually, Commissioner McMillan, I think, wanted to say something, so I'll let her go first.
Oh, just one quick question, just following up to Commissioner Simpson. So with the statement that you just made regarding the district and the Historic Commission being able to take a block and say that, this district and whatever is in here now is a landmark, is that something in the guidelines? I just want to be clear that they can do independently without review or consent of the board?
So
No,
they would only be able to do the landmarks. The board would establish any local district. That is a governing board.
Okay, so we would have to agree on the district itself, and they can establish or state what the landmark is.
That's correct.
Yeah, so they
Okay,
could,
just wanna be clear.
yeah, they could say, you know, these 4 blocks in downtown Waxhaw are significant in our opinion, and we would recommend to you all to establish that as a local historic district. And then once it comes to you guys, you could say, you know, these 4 blocks, maybe not, maybe just these 2 blocks. And then you guys would have the final say as far as the local historic district.
And all of that is based upon the guidelines from that 2011 document that you have right there, that in a lot of what they can do with that. That was
So,
drafted.
yeah, so this document here, it's more of the design. So it has 2 sections, 1 section for commercial, 1 section for residential, and it goes into detail as far as the types of work, and then the certain styling or recommendations to do. So like talks about retaining or restoring false storefronts, you know, the type of windows, recommended practices in general, recommended maintenance. So it's not really a guiding policy for policy, I guess. It's more of a guiding document for, you know, you want to do something to your facade of your house. These are recommended practices as far as restoring the facade, putting in correct windows, you know, similar things like that, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, and just to so that everybody understands, and the way the statute looks to me is that the governing body would establish any historic district or any historic landmark. That's the board decision. But once, I guess, it's established, then it looks like to me, but then of course that's a Charlie question, that it would be the HPC then that would issue the certificates of appropriateness for any alterations or such.
Hey, just an additional thought on a little bit of this. I mean, I don't know that I understand the reason for the conflict between the requirement to have a property owner consent on a historic landmark, and yet we go into a historic district which has the same net effect without the property owner's consent.
Well, we'll double check that, make sure we're correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm going to just echo what Mayor Pappas just said, because I did do a little bit of research on this and speaking with some contacts of mine at the national level for the National Historic Preservation Society. And in fact, the local historic district does require the consent of the homeowners within that district. And if we decide to make, or if we want to propose to make that district smaller than the border that we've already registered at the National Registry, then things get a little tricky there. So I would definitely suggest that you know, some additional research be done in that area. The second piece of this, I wanted to kind of come back and also echo some of the comments that Commissioner McMillan had made with respect to the maintenance or the ordinary maintenance or repair of the properties. I've looked up some other LDCs for other municipalities in North Carolina, and many of them have a clause in there for limitation to liability. So it's really simple, really. But I mean, if a homeowner needs to change some bricks in order to be just in basic repair and something happens, then the town of Waxhaw should be held harmless from that liability. And I didn't see anything like that. I do have a couple examples. If y'all want, I could easily send that to you also.
Yeah, I would love to see that, Jason. Thank you.
I think one of my concerns here with these, you know, F and G is where it says any landmark or historic district. Can we just strike historic district for the time being? Since we don't have one?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I might suggest we come back to it rather than just pass it over.
Or even clarify, or local historic district as opposed to national, you know, differentiate.
Yeah,
We can
I like
do
that
that.
suggestion. Yep.
So change that to local historic district.
Yes.
Sorry, what were we changing to local historic district?
This would be at the first line of G. Is it anywhere else?
Paragraph F.
F.
In
Yeah.
F.
Yeah, because so Blair and I had a conversation about a specific property with the State Historic Preservation Office. So we had a meeting with two members from their organization, and we kind of asked them about the National Historic District and how it was created and why some properties that were surveyed were not located within the district, and then some were. And then we even asked about, local historic district, and they said that even though the National Historic District is established, they said that a local historic district could be different or vary or focus on a different part if we just wanted to do like the commercial part of downtown or something different. So I mean, we have homes that are outside of the district that have National Registry of Historic Places plaque, even though they're not on the National Registry. So that kind of broached the conversation, and I think I've spoken with the State Historic Preservation Office more in the last 3 months than I have in my 2 years here. So hopefully that's a good connection that we're making with them to kind of keep them at the table and like have conversations with them, especially with the historic significance of Waxhaw. So
I would add that if we were to invite them or request them to come and give meet with the BOC and explain the differences and the current laws and all that, I mean, I think they'd be happy to do it.
Maybe that's a retreat topic.
Yeah.
Just what I was thinking.
Let us know and we can get on their calendar.
But unfortunately, our agenda is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's only 2 days, but we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, I think Jeff, if there was a way, I think I second what Blair was suggesting, because I mean, if you look at the beginning of chapter 12 and what it's been driving me throughout this thing, the very first paragraph where it says that the historic heritage of the town is one of its most valuable and important assets. So, I mean, literally, this is like incredibly important. And it's definitely something that's come in from the constituents, is maintaining the nostalgic charm of the town. So if there was a way that we could fit this in, I think it would be pretty easy to justify.
very well said.
Yes, and we will do that. We will reach out and we'll identify an expert. Hopefully their schedule will work with what we have schedule wise.
And that's outstanding. If you wanted, I do have some contacts as well that I could recommend to you that might offer some valuable input.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I have another comment along the same lines of the beginning of that chapter. When we look at 12.2.2, and it talks specifically on designation of landmarks in there, it said the Board of Commissioners may adopt from time to time, amend or repeal an ordinance designating one or more historic landmarks. So, okay, play it out, an example. You designate a historic district, and then the Board of Commissioners comes back and takes a building out of that district because they can.
Yeah, I mean, the board would have the ability to, either add more landmarks or delete landmarks, and that would be the same with the district as well.
So again, that's where I'm looking at the consistency of the language between the two. The landmark section of it and the district section of it should be consistent. And I don't know where that falls within the statutes, but certainly if you had a 1 block district with 5 buildings in it, and now you have this historic district, and the board comes in and takes all 5 buildings out of the district. What do you got?
Yeah, we'll check that. We'll check it statutorily.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we left off, I guess we got through F and G. So then H talks about a lot of time for review and acting upon an application. An applicant may at any time demand in writing that the HBC take final action as soon as possible. Upon receipt of such written demand, the HBC shall take final action at the next HBC meeting, which is at least 21 days in the future. Require information, all application shall not be considered complete until all required information, just talks about a complete submittal. Prior to issuance or denial of certificate of appropriateness, the HBC shall take such action as may reasonably be required to inform the owners of any property likely to be materially affected by the application, and shall give the applicant and such owners an opportunity to be heard. So it talks about the notification concerning the application, shall take action on the application. In doing so, shall apply the requirements of those landmark guidelines that I had mentioned. HBC's action on the application shall be approval, modification, or disapproval for the COA. So one of the other things is they have it's major work, ordinary maintenance and repair, and then minor work. So as it sits now, minor work shall be delegated to staff for approval. Minor work is defined as those exterior changes that do not involve a change to the visual character of the property and do not require subsequent alterations or removals. So an example of minor work that's defined in our design guidelines would be replacing storm windows or doors, replacing or removing gutters, installing an exterior light fixture, repairing or repointing masonry and chimney. So fixing the mortar with the brick would be considered minor work per our design guidelines. So those are some kind of examples that illustrate that. And so that's kind of approved at the staff level. So the staff determines that it is a minor work and then kind of can prove that administratively. And then authentic restoration or reconstruction not meeting zoning requirements. So it outlines this, that the Board of Adjustment may authorize restoration or reconstruction through a variance request if the restoration does not meet our zoning requirements.
I see.
And so-
I saw that we had a spacing issue there, so I'll correct
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Yep. And then next section is the demolition by neglect. So this is still specific to landmarks. So the exterior features of any building or any type of outdoor advertising sign designated as a landmark or located within a historic district shall be preserved by the owner. The owner or other person having legal possession shall, upon written request by the town, repair such exterior features if they are found to be deteriorating or if their condition is contributing to the deterioration. And so then it talks about different defects of exterior walls, flooring, floor supports, chimneys, plastering, mortaring, ineffective waterproofing, rotting holes, exterior stairs, porches, even fences, gates, and accessory structures. Yes.
So the question I have here, back up under A, it says written request by the town to repair. So we make a request of the homeowner to repair their building, and we have all these things here. What happens if they can't pay? And I do know we get down to this whole other process if they have no money, then what? What's the next step? So my house is a historic home and it's fallen into disrepair and there's all these things, and I get a letter from the town and I said, oh, sorry, I can't afford to do that, and it's just rotting to the ground. Now what?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me scroll down a little farther.
So, Madison, I have seen provisions in other LDCs where if the repair is needed in order to prevent any, because of a public safety issue, then the town could make the, I mean, we could do that repair.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as Jeff kind of mentioned, the liability, I guess, of it now with us requiring to do the repair if, let's say, they can't afford it, or let's just say they just don't want to. I'm trying to see.
And I think that gets back to that recommendation I had with the limitation of liability that, you know, is maybe a Charlie question as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to read specifically about the safeguards from undue economic hardship.
So, I mean, let's take this a step further. So let's say, you know, we send out the thing and they can't repair it. So the town takes on that responsibility, re-repair it. So then how do we recoup our financial investment? Do we put a lien on the property?
Yes, I mean, that would be a typical process. And you know, that's, things like that are covered in the administrative section. And I would say we'd probably have the same type process for this. I mean, and that can go from all the way down to lower level code issues like high grass, for instance, where somebody, and that happens sometimes, where we have to go in and mow the property and then somebody doesn't pay it, then, you know, it goes into a lien on the property. So it'd be this, you know, similar process as that.
Yeah,
And then I know under section B here under it says petition, it talks about the administrator may act under the following procedures to require correction of the deterioration. But I mean, some of these things, if you're talking about historic property and you want to have a period, you know, you're not going to put vinyl on it. So if you want to restore it back to the way it needs to be, I mean, that can be a significant cost of money, either for the homeowner or for the town, if we had to do that. Just as a side note, Blair, under this petition and maybe this process, I think we need a graphic depicting it.
I'm sorry, show me that again, where you're talking about.
Down under where it's on 261, number B, petition A, talks about what the process is. I just kind of thought maybe if you did a graphic for the steps, because that's just a very big, long paragraph, and if we had a graphic to explain the steps of what somebody would do.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so where I had scrolled down, because it talks about the finding of undue economic hardship, should be accompanied by a recommended plan to relieve the hardship. And that's kind of vague. I mean, it talks about property tax relief allowed under the law, loans or grants from the town, public, private, or nonprofit sources, acquisition by purchase or eminent domain. So maybe the town should take an effort to find if there are any public, private, or nonprofit sources for funding for things like this, as far as, you know, a body that can provide funding to, you know, a deteriorating historic property or structure. Yes. Mayor Ron.
Along the same lines, we were talking about the inability of or the situation where you might have an economic hardship on a property owner. Who determines what's an economic hardship and what isn't? So say if the property owner says, no, I'm not going to do it, you guys do it.
Well, keep in mind that, you know, this would be a process that's initiated by the town. So, you know, I think it would behoove us to not do a process unless we were prepared to go all the way through with it. So, I mean, the immediate answer, and particularly the way it's written is that, you know, if you had a structure sitting there, while, you know, there might be some type of pressure to act on it, I would not recommend that we do it unless we knew we were prepared to maybe, possibly, ultimately have to follow through with some kind of financial commitment to see it through if the owner is not willing to do so.
Well, again, doesn't that maybe defeat the purpose? I mean, we're in here trying to require a property owner to do something, and they could just look at our process and go, you know, if I sit back and do nothing, they'll do it for me. And I won't have to pay for it until I have to fix that lien.
Well, they could take that stance to it, but I mean, you know, that's why you have, you know, enforcement. You know, that's why you have other things like that in your ordinance that gives you the ability to do these things. Now, you know, obviously, you know, we don't want to do all those things, but, you know, sometimes in some situations it may call, it's just a mechanism. Doesn't necessarily mean we have to have it or have to do it.
So I guess I'm just bringing it up again. It speaks to the liability issue. If I was a very astute property owner and I owned an entire block of our downtown and all of the structures within that block were in disrepair, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to let somebody else pay for this for me. I won't have to front the millions of dollars that it might take to do it, and I'll have to pay them on the back end, but I don't care. So I'm being very concerned about that kind of unilateral authorization.
Yep.
How does everybody else feel about that?
Yeah, I think you can. So here it talks about, you know, the owner or parties in interest providing evidence during the hearing. So I don't know if, with your example, Mayor, as far as them saying, oh, no, I'm not touching this, I don't know if they would claim undue economic hardship. And then if they have means to prove it, I think that's one thing. But if they have no means to prove it, I think that's something a little different. But then again, then who fixes it either way at the end of the day?
Well, it does go back to whether or not you have a cooperative owner. So say if the party does or does not have the financial wherewithal to do it, and they just dig in their heels. They say, you know what, do whatever you got to me, do to me, but I'm not touching this. You do it.
Yeah.
Now what?
Well, at that point, then, I mean, yeah, you'd have to make the decision whether you do or you don't. So.
Hey, Joe, you had a question up there, Sal?
Just a comment. It's abundantly clear that this is probably a conversation we need to have with Charlie, so that we know what we can do and not do. And once we know what we can do, put that into language that tells us specifically, and anybody reading it specifically, what can happen, and tier it up to a point where we're either going to commit to take action, whether it be financial or otherwise, to remedy.
I guess what I'd like to see as well is along that same line is that, again, that choice by the board is going to have to be the driving factor. And so, you know, are we going to literally play bank and finance or take on the financial burden? Or what if the problem just isn't disrepair? What if it's major renovation?
Mm-hmm.
Now who's going to pay for that? Okay, so again, if I've seen this before in other older districts in LA and whatever, very astute property owner figures this out and goes, you know what? I'm not going to put my money out. I'm going to let somebody else take care of it all. And I'll just ride it out. That thing will be on there for a lien till, you know, hell freezes over, and it won't have to be paid for by me. It might be paid for out of my estate. But the town, again, is taking on the burden, which could be millions and tens of millions of dollars. And I understand that, you know, there's a process, but why have the process if you can't get the end result? The end result is that you want the owner to fix the building. You don't want to be the bank fixer of the building, however you want to term it, because then we'll have another line item budget for Jeff to deal with. And it'll be a big one, more than we have.
Yeah.
It'll cost more than the Y.
We'll talk to Charlie about it. Obviously,
Yeah.
a lot of questions to work through here.
Thanks, guys. I'm just trying to bring up the point. I don't want to leave too many what ifs out there.
Understood.
So moving on to Part B, petition. So the HPC may file a petition to the zoning admin listing specific defects and requesting the administrator act under the following procedures to require the correction of the deterioration or making of repairs to any historic landmark or structure located within the historic district in order to preserve and protect the structure in accordance with the purposes of this section. So here's the procedure for that. So whenever a petition is filed with the zoning admin charging that the structure is undergoing demolition by neglect, the zoning admin shall do a preliminary investigation within 7 days of the issue and cause to be served upon the owner a citation stating that the charges in the respect and containing a notice that a hearing will be held not less than 30 nor more than 45 days. The administrator shall investigate and determine the validity of the charge. Upon confirmation, so a citation shall be issued stating the charge and shall include a notice of hearing. The notice shall be delivered. The owner shall be given a right to testify or have a testimony. HPC shall also be given a notice of the hearing and that the rules of evidence prevailing in courts of law shall not be controlling hearings before the administrator. So the purpose of the hearing is to receive evidence concerning the charge of deterioration and other parties in interest wishes to petition the commission for a claim of undue economic hardship. That's a paragraph. So if after such notice and hearing, the zoning admin determines that the structure is undergoing demolition by neglect because of its deteriorating, or if its condition is contributing to deterioration, as stated above, the administrator shall state in writing the findings of fact in support of such determination, shall issue and cause to be served upon the owner in order to repair within the time specified those elements of the structure that are deteriorating. So if the owner and other parties wish to petition for a claim, the administrative order shall be stayed until after the HPC's determination. And so we get into the safeguards from the undue economic hardship, as kind of mentioned before. So the HPC shall notify the zoning admin shall notify the HPC of the citation and shall schedule a hearing to hear the claim. So the owner must provide evidence that there is undue economic hardship. Talks about the financial resources of the party in interest. Talks about the cost of repairs, the value of the land, amounts paid for the property, annual debt, and all of these other things. And so within 60 days of the HPC hearing, the HPC shall determine a finding of undue or no undue economic hardship. And then in the event of undue economic hardship, talks about outlining the plan as far as remedying that or saving the property or ways to help with the undue economic hardship. So I think a lot of the stuff we'll kind of just vet through and go over with more so with a fine-tooth comb. Yes, Anne.
Question on here when it talks about the hearing and all of that, which is fine if the historic preservation conducts all that, but shouldn't this also come up before the board at some point? Shouldn't any of this all be presented to the board for some decision making? Or are they going to be the sole decision makers?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if the HPC has ever seen a request like this. Probably not. But I imagine it'd go to the HPC, but I don't think the general statute specifically says a demolition by neglect. But, you know, looking at their powers, it still mentions review and act upon proposals for alterations or demolitions. So that might just be another list for Charlie. Just to
Well, even here, safeguards from undue hardship. I mean, it talks about the commission holding a hearing, and they can make their findings, but should any of that come up before the board to also participate in that, determining undue economic hardship? I mean, or should it just be the sole decision-making of the Historic Preservation Commission? Shouldn't there be another layer of the board having some of that decision-making or sharing that decision-making to determine if a property owner is an economic hardship?
I think we can do that as long as the state statute allows. So that's what we can check with Charlie. We're happy to do it that way if we can.
I think that's it. Yep, that's it for historic preservation. Is there anything else that anyone can think of that we should bring forward, review further, or ask Charlie as well?
Yes,
I'm
sorry.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, the only question I have, and this is based on a conversation I had with the HPC chair, I just do want clarification on, even if it is designated as a landmark, does it have protection if it's not in a historic district? Because it was my understanding that you can put a landmark on it, but if it's not in a historic district, it can still be torn down. There's really no protection. And so that's the main clarification that I want to get.
I don't think so, Tracy, but we'll check. I mean, if it's a designated landmark, it's protected.
Yeah, I think, a landmark doesn't have to necessarily be within a historic district. Now, I think those outside or in would be protected just the same. But like
On a federal level, it is.
We can know or find out.
I just wanted to, again, go back on that, kind of piggyback off of Tracy's question. So you've got something that was designated as a landmark, and we won't get into the specifics of that designation. And again, we still have the right to remove that property from its designation and tear it down, if that was to play it out that way.
Yeah, that would be a board governing body choice.
But the point is that I'm trying to make that even with a unless it's a federal thing, but even if it's a designated landmark, which has to have the consent of the property owner, the board, any board, this one after, can make a decision to repeal an ordinance with that designation, and then that building can go back to, we'll call it its normal state, and the building property owner can do whatever they want with it. Would that be correct as we're looking at it here?
Yes, that is correct. Okay, so before we dive into chapter 6, do you want to go ahead and take a break?
Yeah, Jeff, just real quick before we do that, I had just a comment for Madison real quick.
Okay.
Madison, chapter 12 was really difficult. The historic piece of this document is probably the most important to the town. And so you were getting questions literally from all different angles from everybody. And I think that, I think you presented it extraordinarily well. So don't take all the questions in a bad way. It's only because it's so important to the town that, everybody's super concerned about this. So well done on presenting chapter 12.
Oh, thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate that. There's a lot of different aspects to historic preservation, and you learn something new every day as far as this, and even speaking with the state historic preservation office. From a 40-minute conversation, I learned so much, and that there's so much more to historic preservation. So I appreciate your interest in it. I think it's important to the town, and something we should continue to focus on.
Thank you, everybody. Great dialogue, great discussion. We got some consultation to do with the attorney, and we'll go from there, and we'll circle back around to this like we will the other things on the back end of the review.
All right, I say, Jeff, you were suggesting a break. This is a good break point. So let's do a 10-minute break till 2:25.
Sounds great.
Thanks. All right, we're just waiting for a few more to get logged back in, so sit tight for a minute. Jeff, are we still waiting for Madison to kick back in?
Nope, this will just be Blair and myself and Lisa.
Okay, very good. And we can go start again. So the floor is yours again.
Okay. All right, I'll take it away with design standards. Everyone can see my screen there, correct? Chapter 6.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, design standards are pretty broad, but they really address so many different details, but it's the details that that you can see every day and make a tremendous impact on the town. And so we tried to be comprehensive, but to the point. And so let me walk you through the contents very quickly here before we dive into the text. We have a section on purpose and scope, which basically answers the questions of who, what, where, and why about design, and I'll show you that. And then we go from the broad to the specific with general principles, and then section 6.4 general architectural standards. And from there, the next section, we've done something pretty unique with this code, where we have recognized 4 different areas where design standards need to have a slightly different tone in order to accomplish the overall goals. And I'll explain that more as we get into 6.5. And then let's see, well, actually 6.5 through 6.8 are those 4 different areas. So we'll get into that and the reasoning behind it. But I just want to start off with, in our first paragraph here, it's the question of who are these standards written for? And so we wanted to be clear that this isn't just for planning staff. It's not just for developers, but for it will serve as a resource for designers and artists and landowners and the general public. So right off the bat, we want to make that statement. As to the why, these different bullet points that you'll see here are taken directly from the public input values that we found through the numerous public input opportunities that we had, both the 2 locations that we held and also the online. And one of the things that produced were a list of values. And so these standards address those values, such as with the first one, this is to help reinforce and make improvements that are in the character and identity of Waxhaw. So that was key. The second one, high quality pedestrian scale architecture. And what we mean by that is when you think of pedestrian scale, we think human scale. And so Waxhaw already is already of that scale, but we want to make sure that we maintain that. And then we get into connectivity. That's a big one. And so some of the design standards here affect that as well. Diversity of housing types, the opportunities for investment, ways to improve the economic vitality of the town. And let's see, we also have employment centers, employment opportunities. So this reinforces or helps to bring about that kind of opportunity that is that really needs to be increased here in the town, or so we found through public input, and as the board has also agreed to when we were looking at the public input. And lastly, health, safety, and welfare, or high quality of life for Waxhaw community. So I want to emphasize what it says here. These are minimum standards. They're not supposed to be something that we hope that people can attain to. These are the standards that people, as they develop land, that they are held to. And if they can exceed that, that's great. So, but these will hopefully help to set the standard. So getting into scope, this basically answers the question of what and where. So these are sort of broad, somewhat philosophical statements about what we're trying to achieve through these standards, and then where these standards apply, and that's for the entire zoning district of the town of Waxhaw. So those are our big preamble statements. And now we get into the general principles that guide it. I want to make clear that a lot of this is taken from our current UDO, and we started from there and improved upon it, I think. So you'll see statements about trying to reinforce Waxhaw identity or encourage that to be continued and shown forth in new development. And let's see, also, in addition to that, the next general principle is that sustainable building practices, resilience to natural hazards. We talk about the use of alternative energy sources, that being encouraged. And then also context sensitive development. And this is particularly about keeping in the character of adjacent properties, not trying to do something that's just going to stand out, but something that's going to fit in, but still encourage innovation. Also, you'll see that we're emphasizing preservation of environmental, scenic, aesthetic, historic, and natural resource values of the area. And moving on to the next page.
If I could back you up for a moment.
Yes.
Just a comment and a thought. I've had some comments by people that are looking at the town and asking questions like, why is everything all red or brown brick? And we've got in here, under A1, we've got the rich architectural vocabulary of Waxhaw presents a wide variety of development opportunities using traditional forms while avoiding any sense of monotony. How do we separate that, or tell me what your thoughts were?
It is a balance to maintain. There is, when you talk about monotony, there are various types of monotony. One of them can be materials. But when you look at cities around the world, the great cities tend to have the same materials used throughout, or at least in the historic areas. And yet there's a rich diversity of building types, but using those same materials. The reason for that, of course, is because historically, there wasn't so much choice about what kinds of materials to use. You used what was available. And inadvertently, and probably consciously too, that gave a certain character and strong identity to that town. So that anywhere you went, you knew what town it was, or if you were just looking at it from a glance as a world traveler, you'd say, yes, this town, this place, this region is identified largely through those materials. So if you're going to have any kind of theme for a town that or identity, it is best to do it through materials. But then, of course, there can be a great deal of richness in how people use those materials. And what we'll see as we get into materials in this chapter is that there is much opportunity to expand on that. But that is the brick and such do form sort of a common denominator. Now, if it's of the opinion of the board that needs to be thrown out and that we need to be, that our diversity of materials or look, tones, color and such need to be much more broad, then that's something that we can do. But it's the opinion of, particularly as we look at those initial values, the first one is the consistent identity and character. That is the best way to begin in doing that. It's not the only factor. There's other factors that we have here, but that's a key one.
I was just looking at it as I wanted you to be able to defend to somebody who comes in from the outside, the clause while avoiding any sense of monotony. So I know some comment was made about Ardmore, about being, consistent on one side, yet on the back side of it, they have a variation use of materials there. And so, do we have something that says, okay, your building, even though, you see one red brick, which was common to the town, but can you have other materials in the same color?
Yes, and in the design guidelines, one of the things that's specified is that there are at least two materials in the buildings. It can't be just one material used. And we'll see that as we get into the architectural principles, not the general principles, but the architectural ones, the general architectural standards.
Okay, I just wanted to give you a heads up on that, because that's sometimes the question we get is, why does everything have to look the same?
Well, oftentimes that, and again, if everything doesn't have to look the same, but if they're harping or if they're particularly focused on materials, it's oftentimes because they can use a cheaper material, or they want to use a cheaper material. It's usually not that they want to use a more expensive material. So that's part of what we're, that's why it's a standard, because it's not always easy to do, but it is something that can be done.
Do we have any conflicts with the state statutes now with a statement like this versus what we can or cannot tell any particular property?
Yes, we'll get into that. These are general principles, not so much you must do this, you shall do that. We're going to get into that. And what you'll see is that we can, the state statutes keep us from having those kinds of statements with individual, individual residents or a duplex, unless those are in a historic district. But everything else, we do have the power or mandate to have some type of ordinance for.
Okay, so we'll jump off the generals and I'll let you proceed. Thanks.
Yeah, and that point will be much more clear as we get into the 4 different regulating areas. You'll see that individual residences, it's mostly just here's some recommendations, but in a historic district, these are rules, ordinance. So moving on from there, I appreciate the comment, and I want to invite anyone to stop me wherever you have a question. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of keep going at hopefully a reasonable pace. So let's see, we are talking about, I was talking about diagrammatic compatibility, but it has to do with buildings relating to one another and of a scale that relates to the scale of the street. Again, just general principles, the specifics will provide more guidance. Architectural integrity, what we mean by that is, in general, architecture that features form following function and avoiding ornamentation that appears just tacked on, but trying to have encourage styles where every piece has a purpose and every piece promotes the whole in the architecture. One example of that that we're trying to prevent is something that we're always trying to prevent with historic renovation, or is things like false front commercial architecture. So much historic architecture can get covered over, and we want to prevent that and discourage that. So that paragraph has to do with that mostly. Another one of the general principles is ADA compliance. We give a brief statement about that it's to be with the ADA current standards, federal standards. And so we just make reference to those rules. So now getting into general architectural standards, applicability again within the jurisdiction of Waxhaw. Architectural style, what I want to point out from this paragraph is that this code will permit a wide variety of architectural expression. But when a design is of a particular architectural style, like colonial or Italianate or whatever, that the features need to be consistent with that style. It needs to be true to the style that it's claiming to be, unless there is some local architectural vernacular, something that's been done locally that maybe departs from that, but that, in that case, we're trying to keep with that particular Waxhaw departure. Again, that Waxhaw style. So architecture does change, but there are styles that are recognizable, and so we're trying to respect that. And when we talk about the local architecture and trying to complement that, we're not intending to precisely duplicate it, but just recall it in its style and encourage imaginative and quality design that is complementary to the existing built environment. And we feel that's a very important statement because there are areas within town that we're, through our zoning, that we're trying to create neighborhood centers. And it's important that those neighborhood centers recall the downtown in some way. Stylistically, what we think is important right from the beginning of our master planning was that these neighborhood centers should be, you should get the feel that I'm in Waxhaw when I'm in one of those neighborhood centers. I'm not downtown, but I'm still in the town. And that those little intersections, those little corners where there's maybe a few businesses and offices, it has the feel of Waxhaw. So that paragraph addresses that to some degree. And so as far as compatibility goes, the next section, adjacent buildings, just relating in similarity in various terms, or various ways, scale, bulk, height, style. So those paragraphs cover that. In this first paragraph at the top, we talk about preserving historic storefronts and removing non-historic facade treatments, which I alluded to earlier, and which is going on right now through one of the facade grant applications. So proportion and scale, again, these things may be obvious, but we're trying to just point them out as a guide. The human scale at the street level, components proportional to the overall scale of the building. Windows vertically shaped. It might be something that we don't think about so much, but that is an important design element in our town. And when you think about some places where office complexes or some buildings where it's a large band of windows, it's a very different look. And so what we're saying here is that we want to have that vertically shaped look. But there are some examples where we vary from that, and we'll get into that when we talk about the different design standards for different areas. But in general, this is what we're trying to achieve. Citing and orientation. This has to do with well, I'll just go into some of these details. Principal building to front a street or recreational open space. Developments as a whole, having fronting on significant public spaces or parks and plazas. Also, we want to think about certain vistas, and that may not be something that we have great examples of in Waxhaw, but we want to respect vistas where there is some important building or element that you don't want something suddenly just blocking the view of that. So we put in a sentence about that, and there's a little bit more to follow. And then in E, alley access. So there's some,
Hey, Blair,
yes.
on number C here, it says all construction shall be oriented to the street. I thought we had a discussion about that in one of our other chapters about orientation of the property.
Yeah, and maybe this sentence needs to be tweaked somewhat because we do have exceptions to that in the design standards themselves. So that may be something that we need to put a little disclaimer on. It's a general statement, but there are exceptions, and so I can.
I remember us having a conversation about being oriented, but I don't remember or recall exactly specifically.
Yeah, in cases where the front facade, well, of particular buildings perhaps, face like a public space, open space and such, or in some residential situations, it doesn't necessarily have to be facing the street.
About it when we're talking about the cottage housing plats.
Yeah, cottage housing, exactly. So we'll take a look at that sentence. It does seem to be a little bit at odds, or at least a little bit confusing and out of context, or without considering the rest of the chapter. And we don't want it to be confusing like that. So we'll take a look. So thanks for pointing that out. One of those exceptions is just below when we look at F down here, campus style development, where the buildings are inwardly focused, and you have a network of squares and sidewalks and such. You think of for instance, a university type atmosphere, but there are other types of campuses. Some can be in offices. So that's an exception right there. So yeah, we'll take a look at that and make sure it's reading in a way that's not confusing. Let's see, and just a little bit further about campus style. It has a unified system of sidewalks and unified design of common themes represented in the design of the buildings and signage and lighting and such. And with that, it also has a master utility plan there, and it would also have a master signage plan.
Hey, Blair.
Yes.
And I know this is the campus or style development. What about if you had something like, and I know we talked about this the other day, and Jeff was here, it was about, and I'm thinking of like Carrington Square. I think we talked about that in terms of lighting or signage. Would that fall like under a campus type thing where it's like a plaza to have some sort of uniformity?
I'm sorry, are you talking about the need for a master signage plan, or I may have missed your point?
No, the conversation, because you said a campus style development, and I get campus style, but what about if it's something like a Curitan or something like Carrington Square? Would we have some sort of design standards for like a main building and out parcels or anything like that, or?
Yeah, and that would be part of the zoning process for a mixed-use development, where that design for the overall development is presented, and in a situation where you'd have a conditional use, conditional district, that would be part of that. And something that should be mentioned here also is the lighting plan as well. So,
And Carrington Square wouldn't be a campus style development because they're not all oriented facing each other towards a square or a green or something like that. But that, as Blair said, would be covered in your commercial design standards.
Yeah, I know that that's not campus style, but I was just thinking if it would have a certain look or feel because it's one parcel or one property being developed into something. But if it's addressed somewhere else, then that's fine.
Okay. Just lastly, in this section, there's a part about protecting the privacy of residents in the citing. Again, these are just overall citing standards. So that's one of the principles of it. So getting into patterns and repetition, just basically what this section is about is that you don't want long monotonous buildings or uninterrupted walls or roof planes. There are ways to break up the architecture, but those things have not changed tremendously from the UDO. However, one element that we've added is the use of covered walkways, colonnades, arcades, those types of features. That's something where you're taking a large block of a building or a long development. Maybe it's, well, I mean, you certainly see it in strip development, but just think about just where you have a lot of retail right next to each other. Being able to break up that mass and bring it down to a pedestrian scale with colonnades and arcades and such unites those buildings, but also brings down the scale. So that's a tried and true feature, and we wanted to write some things about that, which we get into later. But we included that in the patterns and repetition. So in that case, you would have a repetition. It might be, quite a long one, but it's at that pedestrian scale, and it's something that unites the building and also makes for more pleasant pedestrian experience, and has practical elements to it as well. I mean, think of the places where you're able to take advantage of a colonnade or arcade and going from one place to the next. So we want to encourage that in some ways. Let's see.
Hey, Blair, it's
Yeah.
it's just a quick question on that. What's the at what point would you would this be encouraged? Like how long would a building have to be before something like this would need to come into consideration?
We get into those specific standards in just a little while, a little more into the document.
Okay,
So
perfect.
yeah, these are just the general guidelines, but then we do get into specifics about that. So what I want to introduce you to now are the design standard levels. And in looking this over recently, we realized with some help from you all that it might be a little bit hard to track, and we need to have some kind of table that illustrates these different design standard levels. And so we plan on doing that. I'll try to describe it as best I can, and bear with me and be thinking about, oh yeah, if that was in a table, maybe that would be easier to track. So anyway, so let me just go into explaining what these are about. And I'll start off by just reading this first paragraph. While the design standards set forth in this code are intended to promote and produce a common design identity throughout the town and all of its districts, various degrees of standardization are necessary within various district types in order to meet the broader goals of the town. And by broader goals, that goes back to that first page about what we're trying to accomplish. And part of that is greater employment opportunities or diversity of housing, or we have areas that are devoted more to commercial, more to residential. So even though we want a common identity, to achieve that, you have to recognize those differences and design for them, or have good ordinance to reinforce those distinct areas. And so that's what these are about. And what they do basically is provide various levels of opportunity, or recognize various levels of opportunity for individual decision versus standards by the town. One thing I want to point out right away is what the mayor was alluding to, and that is that the state has laws about what can be governed by local ordinance and what can't when it comes to individual residences. So we'll get into the applicability there of when these apply and when they don't, but you'll see that number 4 there is the residential standard level. So that's the least restrictive of all. There are plenty of guidelines in it, but we can only require so much in terms of design for that. Now, I'm going to work from the bottom up, if you don't mind. The opposite, or actually, the way these work is that number 4, the bottom is the least restrictive, and then number 3 is a little bit more restrictive, but just slightly more. Number 2 is much more restrictive, and then number 1 is the most restrictive. And so we'll get into the details of these, but that's how they work out. The employment centers areas those are designed to attract employment. And so there's a lot of different building types, and they tend to be larger building types that we need to relax certain of our rules that we wouldn't want just in the downtown area, but you do want it in an employment center area in order to encourage the kind of growth that we are after in order to meet the town's overall goals. Now, the ones that are probably most familiar to everybody and it is the most typical of the ordinance and the UDO we have now are the standards for commercial, mixed use, and multifamily design. Those are things that we can regulate, and those are going to be the most, that's the largest section, because when you look at the first section, it includes all those things in that second section, in the commercial, mixed use, and multifamily design. But when it's a civic landmark building, or when it's in that neighborhood center district, and even public art standards, those are additional rules. Those are additional ordinance because those are special buildings and they have a unique role. And so we'll get into that, but that's why we have these different design standards. So I'll move into them unless we have a question at this point. Well, there'll probably be questions that pop up as we go through it. So, but hopefully this will show the logic behind those even more. So each one of these areas, first of all, the civic landmark buildings one, we get into the applicability. What buildings does this apply to? And here's where that diagram or table actually would be the most helpful, where for each one of these, we have in the table what applies. If you have this kind of building, which one is that? If you're in this zone, which one is that? So we will supply that, and I think it'll make it all crystal clear, but hopefully it's somewhat clear now. So as you look through this list here, you'll notice that we're talking about building types or building uses. So these are more your civic buildings. They are very often publicly owned buildings, but not always. These are prominent institutional public buildings, but you also have private institutions, private buildings. And so I'll point that out. Some examples are hospitals or nonprofit clubs, certain organizations. That's where this could apply as well. And then the obvious ones in the public realm are town hall and civic halls, post offices, other government facilities. So what we're doing is a bit of a departure than what happened historically. If you go far enough back in history, you'll know and you can see that civic buildings had a great deal of additional design elements that really marked them out as special buildings. And our history includes that. The historic period of Waxhaw, that's how things would be built. But then, as we all know, as we get into later periods in time, say the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, those things kind of fell to the wayside, and public buildings took on a much more guarded and stripped down look. And they say something about the philosophy of the town. So we're trying to bring back a bit of the civility, historic civility to those buildings that would be in keeping with Waxhaw's identity. Notice in the last two sentences there, these standards do not apply to ancillary buildings or structures used for maintenance and storage and such. This is just for the primary buildings. So getting into some specifics here, because it can sound a little scary. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got to build to that standard when I do one of these. Well, we don't think it's going to be onerous. We don't think it's going to be over the top here. But let's take a look. Civic landmark buildings. First of all, it talks about citing. Citing to terminate street vistas where possible so that it is the focal point. I don't imagine that's going to come into play very often or if ever really in development here, but we'll see. But there is something to the placement of important buildings placed importantly on axis or in some manner that gives it a hierarchy, shows that building is important by its placement. So we address that, and then we get into the architectural and site features that are found in the Main Street district mostly. We're trying to emulate that in a way that's authentic to that style. So we talk about that and give some details to that, elements that need to be looked at with that respect. And in C, we get into more the spaces between the buildings. We're talking about well-designed pedestrian plazas, courtyards, landscaped areas. We talk about the predominance of pedestrian circulation, how that needs to be given special consideration in these buildings, particularly larger buildings or complexes that fit into this particular design level, and making note about historic precedent as well. So, you know, a lot of times we just focus on buildings, but it's the spaces between them and the public space that is just as key in establishing what we're trying to do here. And then in D, a particular emphasis on pedestrian orientation, about entrances from the street. How do you go from the public realm to these buildings to what are sometimes private realms? Talk about doors and windows and such. And then lastly, and hopefully this will shed a little more light on what we're doing here. Notice that it says meet all mixed use and commercial building design standards that do not conflict or detract from the aforementioned standards. So that's how we keep this short. We're saying these are the extra special things you need to do for these types of buildings and places. Otherwise, in everything else, you meet the standards of the next section down, and that's the mixed use and commercial building type. So we avoid repetition that way. Let's see, getting into surfaces themselves, we've talked about that. Historic commercial buildings and contributing structures within the Main Street district shall retain and preserve the masonry features that serve to define the overall historic character. And then in contrast, the non-historic commercial buildings and non-contributing structures, they shall be kept compatible with that style. And we get down into talking about the paints and coatings of the masonry. Everything needs to be compatible with that downtown look. So there's a special emphasis on it for these areas. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not just building type, but it's also the neighborhood centers. But we know there's a—
Blair?
Yes.
Commissioner Westlake has a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah, first, and I don't know if this is the correct section or if you wanted to get down to roofs, but one thing that I was thinking about is rooftop patios and bars. That's kind of the new trend right now. Is there any point in here where we could do any type of design structures for that?
Absolutely, and I'm not sure that we've adequately covered it. As we get into the standards for roofs and things, let's keep that in mind and see if what we have here will suffice. But we may need to add a little bit more with that design, with that trend in mind. And it's not just a trend. I mean, it's a practical use of the building. So I'm going to have to say maybe. We've maybe covered that, and we'll get a chance to see that as we get into those particulars about roofs. And the reason we haven't covered it already is because, again, that's one of those things that we don't cover specifically in this, but it will meet the mixed use and commercial building design standards. So when we get into that, we're going to see much more detail about buildings that goes beyond these things. And so let's, if you don't mind, let's hold that question for that area, and we'll get into that. And if it's not there, we need to make changes to reflect that. That's a very good point.
Blair?
Yes.
Else that which might fall under H, and I'm not sure, there's two things under F1 here is we were talking about the hanging signs, and we were talking about making it consistent by having them have a uniform bracket that hangs off their facade. I don't know if that would be applied here. I'm not sure if you were here on that day when we talked about signs.
Yes. Well, we did address that in signage, in the signage section. And what I can tell you is that we didn't do, I'm trying to remember how it was worded, but it wasn't a uniform system, but rather a system that is in keeping with the building type or the sign. If we, I mean, we could zoom over to the signage section to take a look at that, but I know we addressed it. I don't know if that's, would you all like to depart from this section to take a look? Or get back to that, or I can get back to you.
I just know when we talked about signs, we just talked about having a consistent type of a bracket so there was some continuity on Main Street.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is that the bracket, we put in language that says it needs to be, I forget the terms we use, but it needs to be in keeping with that signage style or that building style. I just don't know it by heart, sorry, but we did make that change.
So that's okay. And then here under F1 at the bottom where it says applying paint or other coatings to masonry, what do we do with the current buildings that are on Main Street that are painted, the brick and everything that's painted?
Well,
or does this just prohibit anything new from being painted?
Well, I think the standards now are such that if it's a historic building, that they can't be painted, and I know exceptions have been made, but
because there's two buildings down on Main Street. I think one is the jewelry shop, and then I think the Cork and Ale building is painted.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can step in for a second, so I drafted this small insert because we have something similar in our ordinance now to where any modification requires some kind of approval as far as a conditional use permit in our current standards. So I added this section about historic commercial buildings or contributing structures because there's a huge emphasis on preserving the natural brick, preserving the building as it is. And so, you know, Mary O'Neill's is painted white. It used to be pink. So it's historically been painted as long as I know. And so this wouldn't, so if Mary O'Neill's wanted to paint their building, they would be allowed to because it's been previously painted.
Yeah.
But this guideline here is to kind of preserve the buildings as they are now, to where, you know, you maintain the brick, you know, you allow the brick to breathe, you take care of it, and you're not changing it as far as, you know, painting downtown buildings, you know, white or pink, purple, red. I mean, it's more as a preservation tool. Now we do have buildings in downtown who were maybe built in, you know, 1980s, and, you know, they may not be a contributing historic structure, but they're contributing in a facet of, you know, being a part of the downtown. And so we use this word compatible as far as, you know, kind of ensuring it still matches the details of the downtown. So this is just like another kind of preservation tool as far as maintaining that downtown charm as it sits now. So this isn't necessarily brand new, but it's phrased and worded differently than what our current ordinance has, because it required a full conditional use permit process, which required approval through you know, the Board of Commissioners.
All right, so I'll get into the public art section of this. And the reason public art is addressed in this segment is because it has a similar role. as landmark or ornate architecture, in that it is something that has artistic expression in the public realm, whether it's a private building or private work of art, as long as it can, or public, as long as it can be seen by the public, it has significance for the public. And when you think about some landmark buildings, there's ornamentation in the architecture, and so we consider that public art. So it's kind of the next step, just talking about public art in general. And we point out a few things about public art and a few standards for public art, but I want to just bring to your attention that, as you already know, really, there is a Waxhaw public art policy and a public art program. And so this is perfectly within keeping of that, and that the role of that policy and programs and such is really, it maps out the process for public art. And this doesn't get so much into that process or criteria too much, but this is just overall statements about standards for public art. So we wanted to make sure that this was compatible with the Waxhaw public art policy, and we worked with Parks and Recreation a good bit on that just to make sure of that. But it doesn't describe those processes or whatever. But we do define public art, we give examples, just to make it clear what we're talking about. And what I feel is the more important part here is the standards for public art and ornamentation. Again, ornamentation being parts of buildings. These are guidelines, and you'll notice at the bottom here, public artwork must be approved by the Board of Commissioners. That is the same standard that the Waxhaw public art policy has. It just talks about the process of getting there. Here we're saying that's a requirement, but some of those other standards include obvious things that actually do repeat the Waxhaw public art policy. Things like public art is not advertisement. It needs to avoid being hazardous or a nuisance in some way, whether in its placement or if it's blocking key views or whatever. We address profanity, vulgarity, and then we also get into we wanted to address what might be popularly be termed yard art clutter, or just any kind of clutter. The way we've put it is that public art shall be distinctive and not excessive in quantity on any particular site. And we felt that kind of covered that potential issue, where a work of art becomes a whole collection of just what can be a mess after a while, if it's not done appropriately or with some sense of distinction and some attention to the quantity of it. And then durability, if it's meant to be outside, if it's meant to last, it needs to be built that way. And then that permanent art shall include a maintenance agreement. So let's see, that's really all we say about public art in this, or in the UDL, or in the LDC rather. So unless there's comments about that, yes, go ahead.
Just if we could, in the digital version of this, include the link to the public art policy.
I'm sorry, say again?
If in the digital version of this, can we include a link, a hyperlink to the public art policy?
Okay, well, what I would recommend is that we make reference to that policy, but we don't have any hyperlinks in the LDC because those can change. But we can directly reference it, and that will basically give that policy that level of authority. So we can make it part of the LDC by simply referencing it.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so now we get into more of the meat and potatoes of design standards. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, anyone?
And I know that we're gonna reference a policy in an ordinance, but policies can be changed or they can be rescinded, and I'm not suggesting that the public art would, but I mean, is that something that we'd really want to, I mean, this may be up for the board, is that something that we really want to reference if it's something that could change, where this is an ordinance and a town law versus a policy which could change over time?
Well, usually what you would do is say, you know, the current policy, just like with ADA standards change. So you reference the current ADA standards. We do the same for the engineering manual. Those standards change all the time. As long as we make reference to the current one, we've kind of covered that. I mean, there may be other concerns about referencing that policy, but I think from the point of view of from just the practicality of pointing people to that policy, you know, if somebody's an artist and they say, hey, I want to do public art, and they happen to look at the LDC first and they see the section on public art, they may think, well, that's all there is to it. I just make sure I've done all that, and then I go to a board meeting one night and boom, there it is. And we would want them to be aware at least of that public art policy. So that's an argument for including a reference to it, but you know, I just offer that.
Yeah, no, it just makes sense. I just want to make sure that if we're going to put something that could potentially change, or, I mean, I'm assuming we would always probably have some sort of a public art piece, but I wouldn't want it to point to something that eventually could be abolished or, you know, changed.
If it were abolished, we'd just remove it and strike it from the chapter at that time. But I think it's a good suggestion and pretty good thing to do, to have that reference in there. And so, and just a funny story about yard art clutter, just as a quick sidebar. 15 years ago, working in a municipality where a guy kept building things in his yard, it started out with a California raisin, and then he built an abominable snowman, and then he built some kind of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle looking type thing, and, you know, kept going on and on like that till he had, you know, half a dozen things in his yard. So yeah, some people get creative.
So we're trying to provide some guidelines for that when considered it as public art. So this next section is really the most extensive when it gets into codifying design standards. It's the broadest reach. It's the thing that the civic landmark buildings have to include as well, and then go one step higher. The other sections, the economic level and the residential, take away from it, or they don't have the same level of standards. So as you'll see in the applicability, again, that's going to be something that's more clear with the table, which we'll add. But it says they do apply to all civic and landmark buildings, all residential structures other than single family detached dwellings and detached duplexes, unless, again, table would help, located within the national or local historic district. And we say A1 just if we happen to have one or the other or both. And we do cite the state law on that. One other exception in here that's very important, and you'll see it pop up for individual issues, is that in the commercial, the corridor commercial district, some of these standards are relaxed in some minor ways, which we feel are critical and key for those commercial areas. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't apply in the EC district. So with that applicability statement and being much more clear, I think, through a table, we'll move on unless there's any questions. Right away, we're getting into roofs. So we might be able to go back and see if we have what we need in order to allow for what Tracy brought up. So some of these features, again, they're very close to what we have in the UDO. This first section about roofs and eaves, it's basically a pick two. If you have two of these features or more, that's what you need to have a building that's going to look right in Waxhaw. And so these are pretty typical elements in roofs and that you'll see all over town. I don't know that if you have questions about any of the particulars, let me know. We do say that flat roofs are permitted, but they have to be, we make sure that you have a parapet to conceal rooftop elements there, utilities and such. So that's addressed there. We talk about sloped roofs in terms of materials, pitch. We talk about mono pitch ones. There's some application for that, but it's not very broad. And let's see. So I'm looking in particular for what you were talking about, Tracy. I don't know that it's in here. These are just some particulars about eaves and let's see, again, pitches and such. Let's look a little further. Other roof requirements, drainage, things about what kind of skylights you can have, rooftop equipment screened from view, as I mentioned. More about materials. Here you have something about in civic buildings. So here's an exception, and the ones in the other section, we don't go into roofs in particular, but we do add about gutters and downspouts being a little more ornate in that segment with copper galvanized painted metal. But in going in the other direction, in the commercial corridor district, gutters and downspouts may be construction of other industry standard materials. And again, that needs approval by the zoning administrator. But they can save some money on that, and it will be more in keeping with that commercial district. Talk about warranties. So really, we didn't go into that subject, Tracy. Are there some particulars that you can think of that would be good to add to this section?
Well, the only reason I brought this up was because I remember a few years ago, Mary O'Neill's, when they wanted to extend out the back, that was something that they had wanted to consider was a rooftop patio. And so that made me start thinking that maybe that we needed to discuss whether or not we want that even just in the downtown area, or at least as we move into neighborhood centers. And then any type of, I don't see anything about railings, if you were to have a rooftop, so the flat top roof is allowed, but then you would have to have some type of railing. And do we want to have a design standard for that? I don't know what all is involved in that. You would know better than me, but.
A lot of what's on top of a roof would be building inspection related, but I would be of the opinion, and if we added something in the code here that we would allow for rooftop, whether it be a rooftop dining or rooftop bar type situation, consistent with North Carolina building code standards. If there's, and that's where like a railing and things like that would come in. We could look and see if there's anything specific to zoning that might need to be included in that. But my guess is it's probably mostly building, North Carolina building code related, but we can check on that.
Yeah, I mean, we can cover that angle of it, but at the same time, kind of getting back to your question, are there some particulars that we would want Waxhaw to have that maybe isn't standard? Is there something particular about the railings or some other feature? I don't know what that would be, but maybe you have some ideas about that. Something that's distinctive about Waxhaw without being overly.
I mean, the only thing is whether or not we'd even want it allowed in the downtown area, because if we're going to consider those, historic overlay or anything like that, I mean, is that something you'd even want to allow? I think it would be, unique for sure, but I just remember that was something that came up a couple of years ago, and there wasn't support on the board at the time. And I don't even know if they'd consider it now, but for the future, if anybody wanted to do something like that, do we need to put that in, whether or not we even allow it in certain districts?
It's a good question.
Well,
It certainly affects the character.
I mean, I would be under the thought that, I mean, it's allowed now. I mean, I don't think it's referenced at all in the UDO to my knowledge. I mean, so if somebody wanted to do that, our stance now would be, as long as they met North Carolina building code, they could do that. And now my opinion would be, you know, moving forward in the LDC is that, and we can certainly put a sentence or two in there about it, but I would be of the opinion that we do allow that type in the instance where somebody would want to do that. I know that there has been interest in that on more than one occasion. Now, so far, nobody has done that, but you know, that's a pretty viable part of business for restaurants and bars and other social type of uses like that, which are pretty common to what you find in downtown areas.
Yeah. So is there anything we want to say, like if we were to have a sentence like occupiable rooftop spaces shall be blank, what are some of the blanks we'd want, what are some of the things we want to put in the blank?
Well, I think at the minimum, we want to put in that meets just North Carolina building code requirements.
Yeah.
Blair?
Anything else? Yes.
I don't know if they had something on rooftop, you know, going back to like railings or things, you know, I would want something more decorative, nothing like wood or, you know, you'd want it to kind of fit in with the character. I don't know if it's wrought iron or aluminum or something other than like.
It could be wood though.
Something decorative.
Depends on the building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's getting to the heart of my question. Are there some particulars that we want to go ahead and say you need that in the design? I don't know that materials would be it, as the mayor pointed out. In some cases, wood would be appropriate, I suppose. But I get what you're after.
Maybe the key word there is you say something like decorative, just so we're not, you know, no chain link fence, for example, which I think nobody would want to see. So
Yeah.
I think decorative is probably the key word there that gives you the latitude for wood, wrought iron, or anything in between. But you know, we're not looking for chain link or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blair, I think we do have some words in here about the parapet extending, and I know I've seen in historic Nashville where on the rooftops they extend the parapet beyond that, and it definitely keeps that character.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think you have to look at the building design and the theme that you're trying to be consistent with in any given area. And so, you know, what if the building is, call it for sake of conversation, all metal? You don't want to add a wood rail to it.
Right.
You'd want to make it something, we'll call it, like Jeff said, decorative metal or whatever it is. So I think you want to give yourself a lot of latitude on that, because there are so many variations in building design, even in existing areas where you want to be consistent, but you don't want, you know, a bad mix, you know, of an all black building with a white chain link fence, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And
So
certainly,
yeah, I'm
Jeff's
sorry.
point, you want to, to Jeff's point, you want to make sure that you're consistent with the code requirements. So they're going to have requirements for safety of height and type of materials for those barriers.
Yeah. So basically meeting those codes, and then decorative and in keeping with the architectural style of the building.
I think that would cover it.
Mhm.
That's perfect.
All right. That's easy to add. Okay, good. I'm glad that was brought up. That could be, I mean, that's important, and who knows how much more important it will become.
Claire, I do have just a couple of comments since we're on the whole roofs and eaves, and we talk about things, and I'm just looking at maybe some consistencies or not. When you look at 662A1, you can get a flat roof. And then you've got a situation on the next page where you have, you know, flat roofs are today usually rolled roof material anyway. They have that new sheet material, the vinyls that are out there. I've installed many of them. And, you know, you've got in L, you've got roll roofing is not permitted. I think we need to go back and kind of gather up the types of materials that are out there today versus what you might have talked about rolled roofing 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago.
Actually, the roll roofing rule was something we just added, just recently. It wasn't in the UDO. Would you say that that is something that would be an appropriate method for a flat roof, but then maybe not a sloped roof?
Yeah, the applications that I've used it on were flat roof applications. GAF and all those companies now have this, it's a huge roll of roofing. It could be 40 feet across to do an entire building. And then they come back in and heat seam it for its seal rather than the old, it used to be old asbestos, but some type of, other roofing material that they have to hot mop over. And I don't know if that's what you're referring to or not. One of the considerations was, what does it look like from the building above it next door? So you want to kind of watch that. But most of these roofing materials today are usually white or gray. They can't be in any colors, but they're very neutral, if you will. And they are in huge sheets. And then all the penetrations are heat sealed to their specific form. So I don't know that I would say, unless you had something in mind about the prohibition of roll roofing, I would say on a flat roof, that's going to be your major material.
Okay. And maybe, and it could be that in the UDO, I might have misspoken. It might have misspoke. I'm not sure, but roll roofing might have been permitted, but it needed to be covered or just not visually apparent. And I think we went back and said, okay, roll roofing is not permitted. I don't recall the exact reason for that. Would you say that we should say roll roofing is not permitted except for flat roofs?
Well, I think, first of all, you'd want to make sure what your intention was. So if you deleted it, why did you delete it? And what was that application that you might have been looking at to make that statement? So again, it goes back to everything else, thematic. So what does it look like from around it? And I'm going to tell you, almost all flat roofing material now these days is in a roll.
Yeah.
The other part was talking about on H1 was the roof drainage should not be directed across any walkway or streets. I can't see in too many instances where else it would go unless you took it underground. And, it isn't always feasible to do that. And you certainly have thousands of conditions in the city. I mean, probably tens of thousands of conditions in the town that the roof drainage comes off the building and goes down onto a surface and eventually ends up on a walkway or a street.
Well, from I've seen some areas where it did just dump right onto the sidewalk and presented a hazard, particularly in the wintertime. What I was thinking with this particular rule, either that roof drainage is tied into some type of storm drain system, or sometimes, very often, it is emptied into a landscaped area. Treated in such a way where it's not going to cause erosion. So that's what we were considering with this rule, rather than it going directly right out of the gutter onto a sidewalk or into the street.
In the downtown area right now, we have a lot of those conditions. So maybe if we want to give ourselves some flexibility, we throw in the standard clause of the zoning administrator could amend as necessary. Because I don't know that we want to, in conditions that we have existing, or even an improvement to a building, that we want to go saw cutting sidewalks and then try to figure out where we divert the water to.
Well, that's true. Okay, I'm very comfortable putting the zoning administrator in there to make a call in those circumstances. Jeff, how do you feel about
And back to your comment about sloped roofs, I think with the rolled material, I can see some applications for newer materials coming out that would look better than most shingles on a pitched roof. So I don't know that I'd want to leave that completely out. I understand what you're trying to go to, but then the other part in C1, we've got a minimum pitch of sloped roof should be 512. And then in the next sentence, you got monopitch, which are shed roofs at 612. And so do we want to make that consistent, one or the other? Is there a pitch? Or in a lot of cases, we'll call it newer design, you're going to get less than 612. You might get 412. And there's probably some of those, and maybe even some that are not now historic, but they might be, mid-century stuff was almost always less than 612. It was usually in the, 412 range or less.
Yeah, these roof pitch rules were something that's emphasized in the UDO and just trying to have some kind of a consistent look. I don't know that's necessarily something we have to do, but it was a choice made from an aesthetic, I think, point of view more than anything else. So
And then again, from a design standpoint, do we want to, or is there a reason that you thought they wanted to put no clipped eaves? And so you got a minimum of 12 inches, but building design may dictate something different. Is that, tell me what you're trying to achieve there.
let's see.
Looking at C3.
Oh, C3, minimum 12 inches. Again, it's a stylistic thing, and maybe it needs to be worded in such a way that overhang is consistent with that architectural style, and maybe there's a way to word it for that, so that with some
I
buildings.
think that would work.
I'm sorry?
Again, I think that would work. I think what I'm trying to do is not limit us to a restriction that would prohibit an architectural design going forward.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the goal that we've stated at the beginning of this chapter that we're trying to keep. So that could be a good place to inject that as well.
So on the drainage topic,
Go ahead, Jeff.
I think my suggestion would be, I think the mayor is right about walkways and streets to a certain extent. I think we back that up, and I think what we do want to try to discourage as much as possible that it be directed onto an adjoining property. So I think that's what we should adjust that to.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Let's pick up with, unless there's any other roof-related comments and roofs.
Yeah, could I just have a quick question or just a point of clarity? So we are saying that we are for rooftops. Is that what I'm to understand?
That we are for what? Sorry?
For a rooftop type of structure,
Oh, for
bar,
eating or
restaurant.
public or some kind of gathering.
I think we should be. That's my opinion.
I do too.
Okay. Just because, I mean, at some point, if this comes up, we all should voice our opinion, and it probably will be an issue. So I, for one, I'm for it. So I just want to make sure that everybody has had their opportunity to voice their opinion and concerns. Just make sure before we go any further that
Right.
we all understand that this is our opportunity.
Yeah, speak now and be ready.
I'm actually, Commissioner Morey, I'm actually, like yourself, I'm hearing really positive feedback in the community with respect to that.
Sure, yeah, there's a lot of positive, feedback, but there's also at some point, going to be negative feedback, and that's something we're all going to have to deal with, just like with anything else. So, like I said, this is just our opportunity to put it out there. Any concerns, anything that we feel should be addressed before, because again, once this hits the streets, then it'll be ours to own.
Usually, the negative feedback on those places is the noise level for nearby residences. Almost always. So is there some way that you think we should address that in this section, or is that a noise?
I wouldn't
level issue?
address that in the LBC. I think you keep that in the realm of the town code of ordinances.
Right.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, similar to Dream Chasers, I mean, they've got the garage door up and they have music playing, and it kind of fits under the noise ordinance for that, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Other than that, there might be some like signage or banners or things that are put up there that become, a bit overwhelming visually. That could be another issue. I'm just trying to anticipate what you were talking about, Pedro. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of variables, and since it's never been addressed, it's find the perfect time to, you know, put a little something in there that gives us a little bit of teeth, a little bit of, you know, somewhere to turn when we need guidance. Not just us, but again, you know, future board.
So that's a good point about the signs you're talking about. And because I think of some of I think Queen South might put up some things on their outdoor patio railing there. We don't want to have something like that in the downtown area on top of those buildings.
Yeah,
So would that be addressed some other way or
it's
through our
addressed in
sign
signage.
ordinance? Okay.
Yeah, it's addressed in our signage ordinance.
Okay.
So I'm just, you know, even though it's addressed there, those are issues that usually come up with that kind of outdoor dining experience or drinking experience. So, any other comments about that? Well, we can go from roofs to walls here, particularly the facade treatment. And if you go down to 6.6.3, that's where we get into that. I don't know that there's anything earth-shattering about what we have in these initial code here. I do want to point out in E, we say on corner lots, distinctive architectural elements shall be incorporated at the corner of buildings facing the intersection, but we relax that in the CC district. Encouraged but not required. So otherwise, facade elements are as you might expect. We do say some things about materials there in C. Predominant material of facade, exclusive of windows, doors, and trim shall consist of, when we say here, it consists of stone, brick, or decorative block unless approved by the zoning administrator. I know I bring that up because I'm not sure about stone at this point. Since this has been written, there's been I don't know, conversation about the use of stone for facades. Does anyone have any comment about that, or shall we leave it as is?
And this would pertain to what? Which
Just facades for this section, for the commercial, mixed use, and multifamily design standards.
Like what type of stone are you talking about? I know, like as an example, we had from some of the design things that were put forth for like the park where they had that natural stone looking type thing. Would it be something like that?
Well, we don't get into the specifics here, so it could be.
Or some variation to stone like that, if someone had more of a natural type look as opposed to just all the brick?
I think what this comes down to, you know, you're asking about specifics, and the question is, do we want to get specific with it? And if we do get specific, then we're narrowing that range, and that question has already come up with the use of the heavy-handed use of brick and Waxhaw. Do we also, you know, want to get into, well, you can only use this kind of stone or that kind of stone?
I think you leave it as it is. That's my opinion with stone, brick, decorative block. You know, you cover your bases there. And if you do try to get very detailed about what's what, that just adds some.
Maybe just move the word decorative in front of stone, and then it's decorative stone, brick, or block. Or I guess you can't say that. Can you say that about brick? I don't know, but is there a decorative brick?
Well, I think that it would get the point across. Yes, I think that works.
I know that I've heard, and the reason I brought this up, I think it's from the Historic Preservation Commission, where they've talked about how stone really wasn't part of the vernacular and the architecture here, and they like to try to discourage it. And I know that in our code, when that barbecue place was built in Curitan, that is offshoot of the Stallings rock, what's it called? The rock store. Yeah, the rock store. They couldn't use rock. The UDO didn't allow them to, so they had to build it all brick. This will at least allow that. I can't remember exactly what the UDO says about it currently, but I don't think it didn't permit them to use it there. But I think probably because that was part of that overall development.
I think there would be some locations and opportunities where stone would make sense. You know, that doesn't probably make a whole lot of sense, obviously, in your downtown. It doesn't really make sense in the neighborhood center because we're trying to recall some of the architectural features of downtown. But you know, you get outside of that and still some other areas where people could do some buildings. I think, you know, somebody could have a great building design that incorporates some stone into it.
Yeah, and well, I want to point out here that it says the predominant material of the facade. That's what we're talking about. So that introduces that variety that the mayor was talking about. And so the question is, do we want to allow that as a predominant material, not just the secondary material? I mean, if everybody's okay with that.
I think we just need to leave it flexible,
Okay.
you know, just because I think there can be some applications like, I think Jeff was just saying, I mean, maybe not in the downtown area, but maybe in one of the employment centers, if they wanted to have a little bit different type of theming or look that's kind of similar, but, you know, I don't think we should be that restrictive.
Yeah, well, your point about the employment center, none of this is going to be as restrictive in the employment center. I just wanted to remind you of that. The employment center is going to have much more lax rules, and they're very few. So when we go through that, that'll illustrate what I mean. It's pretty quick and dirty. It's like, here's the basics that you need to keep. We don't get into this particular rule.
And I'm guessing that a lot of this application, again, you know, allowing it to be flexible, we looked at several of the presentations in the recent park design that have a lot of stone on the shelter type buildings.
Yeah.
So I don't think we want to restrict ourselves so much. And I'm going to guess that somewhere along the line, you'll probably find a picture of something that was built out of stone in the 1850s here in the area. So
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd want to restrict it. Yeah, would I want to see, you know, a real ugly looking river rock? Well, I've seen some really ugly looking brick. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's not necessarily subjective, but I think it's going to have to be to some type of thematic design standard. I'll let you guys write that.
Okay. Let me make a suggestion right now. In the interest of time, we could either go forward a little bit more with this in this particular section, or what might be helpful to everyone that I'd like to suggest is we save the rest of this particular section and then go into right now the employment center design standards and the residential ones. Those are quick. We could finish it off the rest of this time with those, and it would illustrate the difference between those sections and this. And then next time we can get into the continue with the detail of this. That's one way we could do it, I would suggest.
That would be fine. We've got about 10 minutes. So I'm okay with that. Everybody else, we good to flip around a little bit?
Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
but just give me a couple of minutes at the very end just to say a general statement. It would be much appreciated.
Okay. All right. So we're flipping through quick pages and you can see its various elements, canopies, windows, colonnades, materials, and so forth, and then common open space. And then we get into employment center design standards. And you're going to see a contrast here. The applicability, these standards apply to all structures in the EC district with the exception of any structure that is considered a civic or landmark building. So we do think, yeah, that could happen. In that case, those should still be held to that standard, but everything else, you're going to see standards that are not near as restrictive. So rooftops, one rule: roof drainage should not be directed across walkways or streets.
I've
One
already
rule
marked that for change. I was moving ahead, so I got that one marked.
Okay.
I'm playing a player role right now. I'm marking all this stuff.
Okay. The reason I felt that rule is important is because I want to avoid issues where you've got drainage right across the sidewalk, it freezes, people fall. So that's my main concern. Okay, facade treatment and building walls. We have, this gets into materials. Let me just read this. Avoid all metal public street facing facades. if utilized in facades facing public rights of way, because we think about how greenways could be a more prominent part of what we need to consider here. Metal should comprise only up to 40% of those facades and be decoratively color coded. Now, one thing, I mean, it might be a good idea to just consider that these employment centers, they're going to be a lot more buffered from other uses. So when we talk about, you know, color coding and all, it's going to look like a, you know, an office or some kind of very light industrial use, but it's not going to be in people's faces. I mean, it's off a ways. So just keep that in mind. We'll get into more detail on that. Utilize color to provide building hierarchy, indicate pedestrian entrances and guide pedestrian uses on the site. Again, there's an emphasis on the pedestrian. There's an emphasis that, okay, this is a big building and you could get lost trying to find your way around. And we want to encourage them to use color as guidelines for that. They don't have to use fancy architecture, but at least make it eye-catching that people can find the entrance, both from parking lots and from greenways and whatnot.
Blair, just for some clarity back on A, when we talked about, you know, you can say it one way and read it with the hyphen another way.
Oh, yeah.
But when we talk about avoid all metal, I mean, I look at that as one word, all metal, instead of all metal.
Well, what that means is that, oh yeah.
I just
you're
want to
right,
make sure
because-
that, just want to make sure that it's understood by the group, that we aren't avoiding any and all metal. We're avoiding an all metal facade, street facing facade.
I think what you bring up is very important, because while we have provided a 40% maximum for, oh no, it says facing public rights of way. So yeah. We have that maximum that helps define what is all metal and what's not.
Right.
I just wasn't sure on that for a moment. So,
Blair,
yes.
also with the all metal, what if somebody wanted a real industrial look?
Well, this allows for that.
But they can only use like 40% metal on the front.
Yeah, let's see. Only up to 40%. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Jeff, do you have
Is
any
that a
thoughts
right
about that?
number if they wanted to go with that kind of architecture?
I don't recall why we used 40% for that. It's a good point, and maybe we should have greater flexibility there.
Or up to a percentage or something like that. I don't know. I'm just thinking if somebody wanted something to stand out where they want to use some color and different things like that in an employment center, but they wanted like that modern industrial lofty type feel and they wanted to use a lot more metal, they'd be restricted to doing that.
I know
think
what we were
get
trying
rid
to
of
do
the,
was prevent buildings that were just like big metal wall, because that can often look, it can often look on the cheap. I know what you're talking about, and that is something to aspire to, I think, for some of these places, but I think we just chose to do it by limiting the amount of metal, but maybe that was the wrong way to go.
Well, another way we could go about it is I think the hierarchy covers that to a certain extent. I mean, if you weren't inclined to keep a percentage in there, if we define it with a sentence of facade hierarchy, something like that, where you just have that little bit of variation in there, I think that could probably cover any concerns about just some monotonous metal type look along the street.
I mean, I agree. I understand what Blair's point is. You just don't want an all metal building, but I also think that if somebody wanted something industrial, modern type architecture, that they might need more metal than 40%.
Well, maybe there's a better magic number, maybe 70 or 75.
However you guys want to word it, I just wouldn't want to limit if somebody wanted to do that type of a design.
We'll tinker with that some.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Okay, so I went over B, and then continuing on entryways, doors, and steps. Again, an emphasis on the pedestrian, just some minimal considerations. Pedestrian access shall be provided from street sidewalks and greenways to principal entrances by means of sidewalk or other clearly indicated paved pedestrian facilities. So we kind of leave that wide open, but still accomplishing the same goal. And then the primary entrance shall be clearly indicated architecturally and cited for ease of pedestrian access from public rights of way, streets, greenways, and then, a fire escape doesn't count. And that's it for entryways. And I need a space in between those two. That happens a lot because when I'm doing formatting, things change places on the page and I need to correct for that. It's just part of the process. Windows, not very much to be said there. Mirrored glass is not permitted unless approved by the zoning administrator. False windows are not permitted unless approved by the zoning administrator. And wherever practical, the form of the building should follow or display the function. That's, wherever practical. So those are more like design guidelines more than actual ordinance, because it gives a great deal of leeway to the zoning administrator and says, hey, this is what we're after, but we understand you've got to build a building a certain way to carry on the function that you want. Just don't try to cover up that function. We feel like that the architecture would be more, it would be disingenuous and not really what we're trying to accomplish. So let form follow function. Yes.
Blair, a couple of us have some hard stops at 4, so I'm going to suggest you pick a breaking point here. What's your favorite in a couple of minutes?
Okay. Well, canopies and awnings, these are very practical measures and they're for the human element. So we do have some requirements there. We've talked a lot about materials and surfaces. I don't want to go into that, but one thing I do want to point out, residential design standards. Let me just show the applicability. Standards of this section are intended as general recommendations for, again, the single family detached and detached duplexes outside of national or historic districts. For those homes located within those areas, the standards in this section shall apply. Additional standards for cottage homes are included in this section.
And we can get into that a little bit maybe next time, because I want to just take 1 minute just to mention something before we wrap up, if I may. I really just want to say to the board how much that I appreciate you taking the time to go through this code like this. I have some of my peers that I've talked to, and I've told them what we're doing, and they've told me that I'm crazy. So to go through a code like this, but I thought it was very important to do it because that way you're able to understand it, able to make your comments, make any revisions, things like that, and then it is your ordinance. I mean, you've really put your hands into it, in which you've done a great job to this point. And I just wanted to point that out, that I know this is a long process and we're still a few meetings away from getting through this, but I know you're hanging in there. I know it's long, but I really appreciate your support and your willingness to go through it like this. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and for all your team to go through it with us. I mean, this is probably in some instances unprecedented, and I think that, some of our peers will say we're nuts. But even if we can't retain every item of this entire code, we have a great book to go to when we need to, and we can do the sound bites for people who ask us. And certainly I get a lot of those questions when I have people come to me and say, well, what can we do here? It's very, very helpful, and it's great. It's going to be a great tool. So I applaud all of you guys for taking all the shots from us, from the gallery over here. So appreciate it a bunch, guys. We really do.
Well, to my knowledge, and anybody that I've talked to, I don't think anybody's ever done this before. I can't find anybody that's gone through it like this. So, hey, maybe we're setting a standard for something.
Hey, Jeff, do you have what chapters we should start looking at for our next meeting?
Thank you for reminding me. Yes. So what we'll do next time, I was going to jump to environmental, but Matt won't be available on the 5th. So let's jump to our more administration type sections. So chapter 2 and chapter 3, that's administrative agencies, and then administration and enforcement procedures. And I would go ahead and read chapter 11 too, which is non-conforming situations. And I know we still got a little ways to go with design standards, but we'll try to cover as much of those as we can. I think chapter 2 will be real quick, and probably chapter 11 too, but chapter 3 is pretty heavy on the processes. You know, how do you rezone? How do you do a text amendment? What are all the administrative procedures, and then violations and stuff. So that'll take a little bit more time. But so 2, 3, and 11.
All right, well, with that, again, thank you everybody for all your input, all the reading that you got to do, all the comments. This is certainly going to be a great tool for us to use, and I'm looking forward to getting it in place early on. So thank you very much. With that, I'm going to close the meeting all by myself. Thanks a lot.